Warning, this podcast contains spoilers for House of the Dragon Episode 2. If you have not watched that, watch that first, then come back. There's some Game of Thrones spoilers there. Be careful. Dragons have arrived on HBO Max. The new HBO original series, House of the Dragon, is a prequel set 200 years before the events of Game of Thrones. You know this, but I have to read it. House of the Dragon tells the story of House Targaryen locked in an epic battle for the Iron Throne and power over the Seven Kingdoms. The epic series promises more drama and betrayal than ever. Listen to the official Game of Thrones podcast, which I co-host with Greta Johnson. House of the Dragon on HBO Max, the iHeartRadio app, or wherever you get your podcasts. And to celebrate, we're back in the Citadel to answer your questions.
Amanda asks, like so many others, I have a ton of questions about the Song of Ice and Fire prophecy. I'm not clear on how it was passed down when the Iron Throne wasn't following a smooth line of succession. Do you think it made its way to Rhaegar, or do you think it was lost beforehand?
I do think it made its way to Rhaegar. We discussed this a little bit last episode, and there's different bottlenecks and potential places where maybe this information could have got lost. The rule of Balon the Blessed is certainly one of those. I want to shout out a listener, Sam F., who sent a really detailed email mapping out how he thinks this information would have been passed all the way to Rhaegar. And I do think whatever path it took, one thing we know from the books is that Rhaegar for a time became obsessed, not even for a time, towards the end of his too short life, became obsessed with the prince that was promised. Prophecy, he thought it was him for a little while. Then he thought that it would be his child. And of course, there are the events with him and Lyanna Stark, which everyone thought was a kidnapping and a sexual assault, but really was a kind of eloping, these two noble people like running away together and being in love with each other. And of course, House Targaryen, fire, House Stark, ice, the Song of Ice and Fire. You could see where Rhaegar was coming from. What we don't know in the books is, even though it's discussed, the prince that was promised prophecy, and it's discussed that Rhaegar thought this could have been him, and they talk about, born of salt and smoke and all these things. We don't know where this idea originated. And what I think the prophecy in House of the Dragon tells, the Aegon prophecy, the way it's displayed in House of the Dragon, I think that this potentially gives us where Rhaegar got the idea. Because we're never given a book or a scroll or some way that Rhaegar came to this information. What if this information was literally family lore that was passed down? And that's why he believes in it so strongly, because it's never really explained why, other than, royalty has a very high regard for itself, right? and his family did ride dragons at one time. Why he would think, actually, that's me or my son, that messianic figure. Now it makes more sense, right? Why he would run away with Lyanna, the kind of actions that he took. I think it did get to Rhaegar, and I think it explains a lot of the things that happened towards the end of his life.
Jen asks, we were introduced to the Dragon Pit in the first episode when we see Syrax return inside after their ride. We see Daemon with his mount, who is much larger later. 2 questions. Can we assume Syrax is smaller because they were born and raised in the Dragon Pit? Did Caraxes also spend their life prior to exile in the Dragon Pit?
Caraxes probably spent a significant amount of time in the Dragon Pit. This is somewhat conjecture. But I think we can assume that because they were locked up, and this is talked about, this is in the books a little bit, when Dany's dragons are being held, underneath the pyramids there, that I think we can assume that the fact that they are kept stabled indoors for a period of time does cause them to be smaller. That said, the dragons are pretty big right now, and certainly Vhagar, who is wild, we can assume is huge, although we haven't seen them yet. All of which is to say, I think, though it's never spelled out, I do think we can safely assume that housing dragons indoors stifles their growth potential in some way.
Erica asks, during the fealty scene of episode 1, the lords all swear by the old gods and the new. However, in Game of Thrones, it seemed like people that worshipped the old gods were strange or old-fashioned. Cat Stark made it a point to say she worshipped them, and it seemed like it was a point of pride but also unique. But in this older world, it is apparently common. Can you explain the difference and when the old gods went out of style, like low-rise jeans? Thank you.
I think, unfortunately, low-rise jeans are back. The 90s are back, folks. That
No.
said, the early 2000s, are back. But I think you're right, Erica, that the old gods, particularly in the south of Westeros, are seen as a more peculiar custom. And this is because of the ethnic makeup of Westeros, particularly south of the neck, south of the north. The first men were the first human inhabitants of the continent, and they worshiped the old gods. This, by the way, so that's like also shortening many centuries of warfare between them and the elder races, the children of the forest, who originally worshipped the old gods. The first men cut down the trees, and then they went to war with the children of the forest. But then they came to an accord, and the first men took up the religion of the old gods for their own. So the first men worshipped the old gods, and then sometime many centuries ago, a group called the Andals, who are an ethnic group who come from Essos, north of where the free city of Pentos is now, these hills over there called Andalos. They began migrating to Westeros probably to escape the growing threat of the Valerian Empire, who were a slave-holding economy. Like if the Valerian Empire were very aggressive in expanding, and if they expanded into your territory, you had a great chance of ending up in chains working in some fucking slave pit somewhere. And so many cities and groups were just like, let's get out of here. And the Andals were one of those groups. They weren't like a unified group. It was like many tribes of Andal ethnicities. And they brought with them iron weapons, better armor than what the first men had, and they brought their religion, which is the faith of the Seven. And that began a long and very violent process by which the kingdoms of the first men were overthrown and replaced by Andal kingdoms. Now, there were some notable first men kings who bent the knee. You know, they held out long enough and they were strong enough, and they bent the knee, and they are still around. You know, House Royce in the Vale is one of these. House Strong from the Riverlands is one of these. And the Andal invaders never managed to get a foothold in the north. They could never get past the neck. And so in the north, the blood of the first men remains essentially pure, and the old gods are the dominant religion there. They are worshipped everywhere. Generally, we should assume that the first men families in the south who survived converted to the faith of the Seven, but probably not in every case, right? And probably they maintained that respect for their history, and that included a respect for the old gods. And certainly we can assume by the fact that the heart trees are still up in King's Landing and elsewhere in other castles. They're not cut down as, you know, that kind of embodiment of the worship of the old gods. That tells us that even though the faith of the Seven is dominant and the Andal culture is dominant south of the neck, there is a respect for that religion, even though the dominant culture thinks of it as like strange or old-fashioned.
Harvey asks, speaking of which, Corlys made specific mention of second sons to Daemon at the conclusion of episode 2. Do either of them have ties to the actual second sons from Game of Thrones?
This is a good question, and maybe a little confusing, I think, for folks, so I'm glad you asked this. Corlys is making a reference to the fact that second sons in Westerosi society, this feudal society, are in a subordinate position to the eldest male child, and therefore they don't inherit anything. Firstborn sons are the heirs. Think back to Game of Thrones, right? Robb Stark would have been Lord of Winterfell and leader of the North, leader of the entire North, had things gone the way they should have. Bran would have got like a nice fortress somewhere, and probably would have been an important advisor to his brother Robb. But but you can see that the difference between those things, like ruling the entire North or having a nice castle and being your brother's like advisor, that's a wide gap, right? Similarly, Brandon Stark, Rickard Stark's eldest, was heir to Winterfell, but then the Mad King burned Brandon and Rickard, and so Ned Stark ascended to Lord of Winterfell. And as we heard him kind of talk about in Game of Thrones, and he talks about in the books, it was never in the plans. That was it was very unexpected that he thought he was going to go away to war and maybe die. And before that, he never even imagined that he would be Lord of Winterfell. So it was a surprise to him. So basically what Corlys is saying here, since Daemon is the younger brother of the king, is, hey, you and me, we weren't handed anything. We live in fucking castles, right? And we are in nobility. But we were never handed anything. We had to work for everything we had. And so, that gives us an edge over these like soft eldest sons who are just handed stuff. And the same kind of holds for the second sons, the mercenary group. Their name, obviously, is a reference to the fact that a lot of the notable figures who made up that group were second sons from Westeros who weren't going to inherit anything and therefore had to go and seek their fame and fortune elsewhere and joined a mercenary group.
Alex asks, it seems like kings all either hate the job or are psychopaths. Did any of them have a good work-life balance?
Basically, no. I mean, old King Jaehaerys had a very, very long and mostly peaceful reign. There were some, issues in the Narrow Sea with pirates and corsairs and things like that. But no large-scale wars, and yet he was always dealing with, like, his kids either being wild to the point of being, kind of embarrassing / detriments to his reign. This is mostly his daughters who were just like, Paris Hilton wild princesses doing whatever they want in a way that was like not dignified or thought of as dignified by Westerosi society, which is also obviously very male hierarchical and not focused on female freedom. So that was, their actions were seen as kind of embarrassing to the king, and the king had a lot of heartache about that. And then also his heirs kept dying in fluky ways sometimes. So even what was probably the best Targaryen king of Westeros, and certainly who had the most peaceful reign, he was tremendously unhappy, particularly towards the end of his life when he was very, very lonely. So the answer is no. Heavy is the head that wears the crown. Somebody wrote that one time, and that's true.
Very true. Zabby asks, this is more of an episode 1 question, but what's with talking about the Rhoynar and especially their inclusion in the title scene when naming Rhaenyra on episode 1? Because in Game of Thrones, they would never name them and just mentioned the Andals and the First Men.
I think they must have mentioned the Rhoynar in Game of Thrones at times, but maybe we missed it. That said, the Rhoynar are, again, another ethnic group from Essos. Actually, all humans in Westeros came from Essos. The First Men, too, migrated over across the Arm of Dorne, which is now the Stepstones, because the Children of the Forest used magic to break it, to stop the First Men from coming over. But basically, all humans in Westeros came from Essos, and the Rhoynar are another one of these migrations. They came from the banks of the River Rhoyne in Essos, where there were a bunch of free city-states that got into a series of really, really brutal wars against the expanding Valyrian Empire. Once again, the Rhoynar had this really cool, like, river water magic that they used against the Dragon Lords and their fire magic. So that must have been really, really, amazing to watch. I would love if they ever depicted that on the screen. And though the Rhoynar fought really well and won some really important battles against the Valyrians cooperated. They fought as a united front, whereas the Rhoynar city-states kind of fought pell-mell. They never banded together, and so they were picked off one by one. In what was basically the final battle, the Valyrians used hundreds of dragons to brutally crush the Rhoynar resistance. Though, as a kind of doomsday scenario, after the Valyrians won, the Rhoynar used their river magic to cause the river to flood, and then a big fog came down, and the fog was filled with grayscale, and the Valyrians began to die of grayscale in great numbers. That said, having heard of this brutal defeat, Princess Nymeria of one of the city-states called Nysar was like, okay, we can't fight them. let's get out of here. So she gathered every ship she could find, 10,000 ships, the legends say. Who knows if that's right. And she took all her people to sea, and the journey from the Rhoynar was, across the world was extremely arduous. It's very, very dangerous. Many ships were lost. They encountered pirates. They encountered storms. They encountered fierce corsair kingdoms, endemic diseases, deadly parasites, religious cults, and more. And eventually, after several years of this, the remainder of the fleet, because some left and some stayed in different areas, there's some communities on the stepstones that say, hey, we are descended from a ship that left Nymerea's fleet and decided to stay here. So the fleet that remained under Nymeria was by that time 80% women, and many of those were warriors in the Rhoynar tradition. They landed in Dorne near the mouth of the River Greenblood. Nymeria then made an alliance with House Martell, marrying their lord Mors Martell. Mors was at that time locked in a battle for supremacy in Dorne with the other noble houses of Dorne, and he looked at the Rhoynar and said, they know how to work metal. They have really great skills at leatherworking. They are fierce warriors, and they know poisons and stuff like that. And because the place they landed was a home of the sandy Dornish, the more desert area of Dorne, the fact that they have this water magic, I'm sure, was a big deal. That was really important too. So Nymeria and Mors married. And as a signal to her people that this was it, they were home, they were not going anywhere else, Nymeria burnt all the ships. Alicent and Rhaenyra are talking about this in episode 1 in the Godswood. They're reading, that history book about this event. Then Mors and Nymeria went to war and basically conquered Dorne. So Dornish customs are heavily, heavily influenced by Rhoynar customs. Most notably, the equality of the sexes. This comes directly from the Rhoynar. In Dorne, the eldest child, regardless of sex, inherits, which is a big, big difference, obviously, from the rest of Westeros. And that's a direct result of the influence of the Rhoynar. So including the Rhoynar in the list of titles, it's interesting, right? Because Dorne is not part of the realm. This is more of a statement of intent, right, than a statement of reality. This is the Targaryen saying, hey, one of these days we're going to conquer Dorne. It just hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, I want to also just shout out Ian, who basically asked a similar question. So I think that was a really good, thorough answer to something that I think quite a lot of people were like, Rhoynar? I was like, this is an interesting choice. So I like that, a statement of intent rather than a truth. Chang asks a question that I definitely have been wondering myself. Why is Viserys so concerned about provoking the Free Cities by taking out the crab guy that they're presumably funding, but the Free Cities aren't worried about provoking the throne by funding the crab guy in the first place? Do the Free Cities want a war? Or do they just know that Viserys will avoid one, so they're taking full advantage of that situation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would assume, first of all, that the Free Cities have some pretty good intelligence about the kind of king that Viserys is. So I think that they're doing this in a very purposeful way. Now, the Free Cities have mostly been kind of warring against each other over the years, and the Free Cities are not like Westerosi society, this kind of feudal society. They're more like the way Valyria used to be, in which it's a more mercantile, market-based capitalist economy in which all the rich people rule. And they're also a slaveholding society, whereas Westeros slaveholding has been outlawed for a while, except the Iron Islanders still do it in their weird ways. Anyway, so recently, in terms of the events of our show, 15 years before the opening of our show, the Free Cities of Lysmere and Tyrosh banded together to take on the powerful Free City of Volantis for control of the so-called Disputed Lands, which is basically an area that's right. If you walked across the stepstones to Essos, you'd come to the Disputed Lands just north of there. That's right there. So the Triarchy won. They beat Volantis, and they are clearly feeling themselves right now and have decided to move into the Stepstones. And as we've been saying, listen, Dorne is not part of the realm at this point, and the Stepstones are right across from Dorne. So you can see how potentially, certainly if I'm a member of the small council, I'm worried about an alliance between the Triarchy and Dorne. I'm worried that is either happening right now or that it could happen. I don't think the Triarchy is looking for war right now. I think what they're doing is kind of like moving into a gray area. The Stepstones are basically, they're part of Westeros, but they're also a place where like the laws of King's Landing don't really reach there, as evidenced by the fact that there's intense pirate activity there. So I think the Triarchy is kind of like towing up to the line to try and grab some land and maybe provoke the ruling regime of Westeros into making a mistake, maybe. But I also think, listen, I think that they know who they're dealing with. I think that they perceive Viserys as weak, and I think this is why they are doing this.
Matt asks, where is Aegon's painted table? I thought that it was put into the main room of Dragonstone before the Conquering, but in the scene with Daemon and Mysaria, that room was empty except for their small table.
Yeah, Dragonstone's a huge castle. I think that Daemon and Mysaria were just in another room, and not in the painted table room. The painted table room is we should assume still up, since we see it in Game of Thrones and it's still up. And of course, if you're a Targaryen, you're not going to touch that thing. It would be such a statement piece to have that. You're not going to move that around. So I think that they're just in some other room.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of statement potentially on like how comfortable Daemon feels there. Like he's kind of sequestered away. This is a big question from Baloo, but I believe that you can do a good potted history version. How do dragon eggs work?
It's a good question. Funnily enough, I don't think the Targaryens actually really know either. I think there's a significant amount of magic at work here, but basically what the Targaryens would do is when a prince or princess was born and it was in its infancy, they would take a dragon egg and put it in the cradle. And if that egg hatched, the child would form a bond with that dragon. Now, that would be their dragon. That would be seen as a really, really good sign that this, Targaryen prince or princess is a real Targaryen made of the same stuff of Aegon the Conqueror and could potentially rule. And it's seen as a kind of like a mark against a Targaryen during this time if you don't bond with a dragon. Like Maegor the Cruel notably didn't bond with a dragon for a little while, and people thought it was strange. In terms of like how they work, later on, after the dragons die out, there are attempts by the Targaryen leadership to try and get these dragon eggs to hatch again, and they can't do it. So I think that what is going on here is some sort of magic that they have not quite figured out. They put the egg in the cradle and that works, but in terms of do they know why it works, I don't think they know why it works, and I don't think anybody necessarily knows why it works either.
Yeah, it's almost like they take it for granted and then that comes back to bite them when the dragons die off and they don't know how to do it again.
Yeah.
Kirk is coming in with the big final question for this week's Ask the Maester. Very good question. I feel like everyone in Westeros and the wider world is asking this question. Does no one clean the Iron Throne?
I don't. When I interviewed Patty for the official House of the Dragon podcast, I said, like, why don't they throw some pillows on that thing?
No cushion. No velvet cushion.
And he said something that is, honestly, like, absolutely right. And I think it's what Aegon was kind of going for anyway, which is the seat should not be comfortable to sit on, right? Mm-hmm. That's how they view it. It should have these sharp edges. You should be on edge sitting there and be pointedly aware of the power and the danger all around you. That said, I think there's also a significant amount of, like, obviously they don't understand about infectious disease and bacteria, right? They just don't understand about it. And they view, as we have said, any kind of like cuts that a person would get from the throne as some kind of sign that, this person maybe is being rejected by the throne and therefore does not have the authority to rule. And also, I think there's also like a little bit of magical weirdness going on. Like Maegor the Cruel, I think, as we said, when after 6 years 6 months and what was it, like I think it was like 6 months and 6 weeks of a reign, 666. They found him dead on the throne with the blades of the throne somehow like stabbed through his body, like he was impaled on it. And how does that happen? That's never been explained. So I think that there's also like a significant amount of weird magic shit going on.
Yeah,
with
like
the
the throne can reject you in different ways.
Yeah, in addition to the fact that it is just really, really gross and probably no one has cleaned it and probably Maegor's guts are still on that throne dried up and nobody has wiped it off. That's it. Don't miss the new HBO original series House of the Dragon, now streaming on HBO Max. Don't forget, if you have questions, send them to us at askthemaester@gmail.com.